Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show. Today, we're looking at a source from the Health Independence Alliance that makes a pretty bold claim that Utah is now the epicenter of a major health freedom movement. And the wild part? According to them, this entire thing kicked off because of one single court case.
So that's the big question we're diving into. Based on what this source is claiming, how does the prosecution of one doctor go from a courtroom drama to, well, letting a fire under an entire state's legislature? We're going to follow the breadcrumbs the article lays out and see where they lead.
And it all starts right here, with this man, Dr. Michael Kirkmore. The source paints his case in Salt Lake City as the absolute flashpoint, the ground zero for everything that came after.
On the surface, the accusation was simple enough. Dr. Moore was charged with giving vaccine cards to people who, for whatever reason, decided against getting the COVID-19 shot. But as we're about to see, the trial itself became way more complicated than just that.
And here's the first major twist. According to the source, a pretrial ruling completely changed the game. The judge sided with the DOJ, deciding that any evidence or discussion about potential risks or harms from the vaccines was off limits. This one decision, the article argues, pretty much set the stage for the entire legal fight.
So, with that rule locked in, the trial's focus shifted. It became all about the definition of coercion. The source really zeroes in on specific arguments from the prosecution and some pretty surprising rulings from the judge that it claims were central to the whole thing.
You can see the prosecution's angle right here. The source calls this a hyperbolic strawman argument. Basically, they were setting this incredibly high bar for what force means, implying that unless someone was literally holding a needle to your arm, it just didn't count as coercion.
And then you have the court's take on what was at stake. The judge actually ruled that things like losing your job or not being able to go to school, well, they weren't unthinkable consequences. According to the source, this ruling that job loss wasn't a severe enough pressure became a huge point of contention.
The DOJ also had an answer for patients in desperate situations, like needing an organ transplant but being denied for their vax status. Their official line was, hey, they could have just sued. The source suggests that for someone in a medical crisis, taking on a lengthy court battle was, well, not exactly a practical option.
But then, the trial took another turn, uncovering a layer that the source says is the biggest bombshell of all. Testimony from the prosecution's own witnesses started to paint a very, very different picture of the vaccine rollout. The question became, was this really a public health response, or was it something else entirely? So you end up with these two competing realities. On one hand, you have the official story we all heard, a public health initiative led by agencies like the CDC. But on the other, you have what the trial testimony allegedly revealed, a full-scale logistical operation run by the Department of Defense. And that distinction, that became a cornerstone of the defense's argument.
The source actually traces this all the way back to an executive order from September 2019, claiming it laid the groundwork for Operation Warp Speed. It then jumps forward to a 2025 trial, and yes, the article does say 2025, where it says witness testimony finally brought the full scope of military involvement out into the open.
This quote right here, from a former CDC task force lead, is held up by the source as a key piece of evidence. You know, using military language like encounter with the enemy when talking about public vaccine hesitancy. That was highlighted to suggest a very specific and very non-medical mindset was driving this thing.
So how did this actually work on the ground, according to the testimony? The source lays out this direct military chain of command. First, the DoD writes the contracts. Step 2, they put their own people inside the vaccine manufacturing plants. In Step 3, the DoD and its partners handle the entire tracking and distribution system. The argument here is that it was a military op from top to bottom.
And this all came to a head in the courtroom when defense attorneys started arguing that these deals with pharma companies weren't just regular agreements, they were military contracts. The source alleges that the government worked hard to keep this quiet, even blacking out documents to hide the DoD's role.
So, after all these alleged revelations and all the public buzz around the case, the action in Utah, according to the source, moves from the courthouse to the state house. It apparently kicked off a huge wave of new laws.
So, what did this legislative response actually look like? Well, the source points to a few big ones. A new law allows doctors and patients to make private deals for non-standard treatments, which seems like a direct response to cases like Dr. Moore's. Another law prevents discrimination based on someone's immunity status. And maybe the most direct of all, a law that bans employers from forcing genetic treatments, specifically calling out mRNA.
And to make sure these new laws weren't just for show,
The state gave them some serious teeth. That law about forced genetic treatments, it comes with a massive $100,000 penalty for each violation. That's some serious financial muscle to make employers and insurers think twice.
So what's the ultimate goal here? What's the big solution being proposed by the source? It's this idea of a new separation of powers. The argument is for creating clear, bright lines between medicine, the government, and private industry. The goal, in their view, is to shield our personal health decisions from all that institutional pressure.
And that really leaves us with this final thought. The source is holding up Utah as a kind of test case, a blueprint. So when one state makes such a dramatic move in a totally different direction on these huge issues of health policy and personal freedom, what does that mean for the national conversation that's bound to follow? Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show, produced and archived at the website dailybriefs.info.